Hi, good afternoon. Thanks for joining us on a Friday and finding the time to be here with us. We're really excited. So my name is Dr. Alison Bellevue. Please just refer to me as Alison. I am a clinical child psychologist who works at CBT DBT Associates as the Director of Child, Adolescent, and Family Services. And I am here and really excited to be joined by one of my friends that I went to grad school with and colleagues to be talking to you about this really important topic of how do we understand race and talking to kids about race and racism and those issues. So I was also supposed to talk about other housekeeping things. So we know about recording. You all are muted. It's really so that background noise doesn't come in and kind of be disruptive. We are going to have time at the end for questions. So if you prefer to ask those questions at the end with your own voice, we would love it. And feel free to unmute yourself at that time. If you prefer to ask questions via the chat, you can do that too. And Stacie and I will get it. And if during the talk, a thought comes up or a question comes up and you don't want to lose it, that would be what would happen to me. You can chat it to us at any time, but just know we're going to answer them at the end because we don't want to lose our train of thoughts. Okay, that's all I got. Go ahead, Stacie.
All right, off to me. Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us today. So as Alison mentioned, my name is Dr. Stacie Shivers. You can feel free to refer to me as Stacie. I'm a clinical psychologist licensed in both New Jersey and New York, as well as a New Jersey certified school psychologist. I have a background working with children, adolescents, and families, as well as adults in various settings, presenting with a multitude of different challenges and presentations, including anxiety, depression, ADHD, learning disorders, etc. I have extensive experience conducting psychoeducational assessments and also consulting with school administrators and teachers as well. I currently work at a group private practice in Millburn, and I also teach as an adjunct professor at Rutgers University's Graduate School of Applied and Professional Psychology and at Caldwell University. And one of my passions that I love is that my background is as a professional dancer and as a dance educator really informs my work as a psychologist. So I love to weave that in at any point and any time that I'm able to do so. So I'm so honored and excited to be here with Alison and all of you today. And I look forward to hearing your thoughts and to sharing our thoughts as well. So I'll kind of just jump in a little bit with our objective, and then I'll turn it back over to Alison. So there's so many reasons for why we wanted to offer this discussion today. It's such an important topic, you know, talking to children about race, not only because of the current climate of our society and everything that's happening that we're hearing on the news, but also because of the history of systemic racism and oppression that our nation is established on. So although these discussions can be quite uncomfortable when you're talking about race, oppression, prejudice, social injustice, it's important for us to remember that children are never too young to learn about diversity. And it's really up to us as parents, as caregivers, as caring adults to be able to have the confidence in our children to know that they are able to handle difficult topics and situations, especially if we're able to model appropriate conversations, choices, and behaviors. So as a result, you know, I think our role as adults is to be honest, to be specific, and to be trustworthy as we raise them and influence our children in our efforts, as our community efforts to confront and abolish racial injustice. And so because this is so important, that's the reason that we wanted to be able to have this conversation, to really equip all of the adults who have experiences with children and helping them navigate an understanding of, you know, what is happening in our world today. So I will go ahead and pass it over to Alison.
Thanks, Stacie. So there's been lots of articles and blog posts and webinars and discussions about race, which is amazing. And I wanted to just orient everyone to the kind of focus or the way that we're kind of talking about this issue. So Stacie and I are going to take a developmental approach to understanding race, and also using that to understand how best to talk to kids about race, right? So we're breaking it down by age groups. And we want to start by giving you just like a brief understanding, kind of the surface of the theory behind where these kids are at different ages, right? So we're going to talk about where they are cognitively, meaning what their ability is and how they think about things. We want to talk about the typical social kind of milestones and development at different ages, how they see the world and others and how they interact in that way. And then also how they understand race or how they view race in that way. Now, that is different than their racial identity development. We are talking about what they understand about the concept of race at different ages. So we're going to start there, and then we're going to use that information to then come back around and really give kind of tips and advice about knowing these things. How do we have these conversations with kids at different ages? If that makes sense. Okay, so I am in charge of the kiddos, the littles, and then Stacie's going to take it back over for the older kids.
Yeah.
I have a little running around. That's why I chose the littles. I like to know what's going on with them. All right, so we're going to start with the toddlers. So when we talk about toddlers, we're talking 1 to 3 about, right? And so cognitively, how they're thinking is, one, they have a very short attention span. I'm going to keep that in mind, right? They're buzzing around to lots of different things. Also, time doesn't make so much sense to them. I don't know people who are participating, kind of what age group they're working with, or kind of the kids in their lives, but you might notice that younger kids will talk about the past as like, well, last month or a week ago, like they have no concept, right, about what's happening in the future, the past. It's a little fuzzy. And also, they're not able to separate pretend and real, right? Fantasy and reality kind of blend together. But they are beginning to understand kind of the rules, what's happening, and kind of what's expected, and also really grouping things. How do we put things into categories? In terms of social development for that toddler age, they are certainly trying to develop their own sense of self and their individual kind of identity and person outside of others, typically those adults that are kind of their caregivers and around most. But they also believe that they are the center of the world, and things revolve around them. So their awareness of others, not so great, but that's fine because that's what we want them to do. That's what they do. And they are kind of understanding that there are expectations put on them and that what they do impacts things and there's feelings, but they're not really sure what's going on with that. And in order to express it, they do a lot of play, right? They express kind of their understanding of the world and their emotions through imaginative play. In terms of their understanding of race at a toddler age, we actually know that before even 1 year old, beginning at 6 months, that babies notice and recognize physical differences that are associated with race. They notice different skin tones, colors, they notice hair textures that are different, facial features that look different. They are understanding, they notice those differences. Now, they haven't ascribed any meaning to that. They haven't been socialized into what those differences mean, but they recognize them. We also know that as early as 6 months, that infants show preference towards adults that have similar physical attributes as themselves. Now, this is studies that are done with infants who are being raised by adults. Their primary caregiver is the same racial category as they are, right? So they show those preferences. And what's interesting is that information tells us that the positive way of viewing race is about those positive interactions, not about negative interactions with others of different races or who look different, right? It's about having more positive, comforting, secure interactions at a young age with a multitude of people who look different. So then we get into the toddlers, right? And as early as 2, they are beginning to understand or get a sense of racial stereotypes, what kind of the expectation is depending on how people look. And they do identify racial categories, and they favor children of the same race as themselves. Okay, so that's what we know kind of in the toddler era. So we're gonna move on to the preschoolers. The preschoolers are like from 3 to 5. So cognitively, how they're thinking is still kind of the center of the world, but a little bit less. They kind of acknowledge that there's other things going on. And what's helpful is that they're better able to express their thoughts and their feelings through words. It's not just actions. And their sense of time is becoming more developed. So they can think about events that have happened in the past, the present, and that will happen in the future, right? But think short term, like end of the week, tomorrow, or like a month, right? In that range. They're starting to understand cause and effect, and there are a lot of whys. They're interested in the world around them. They want to know why things are, how things work. They're curious. They're little scientists trying to navigate and engage with their world, and also very concrete. So what they understand is what's in front of them and what they can see. The abstract thinking, the concepts, to be able to hold something in mind isn't there yet. It's really what's in front of them. Socially, fairness becomes a thing in preschool. Everything needs to be fair. And they understand that there are certain rules. They think about like classroom rules are coming up, and they want to follow them. And everyone should follow them. Like, it's not fair if someone doesn't get to follow them. There's less physical aggression, which in some ways is top notch. But what comes in is the verbal aggression. So great, right? So teasing begins to happen. Understanding that that does hurt people's feelings, makes an in-group and out-group, that happens. And then their imagination comes in, and because they can think about things happening in the future, we do see that they can start to worry more, right? Like fears can come up around preschool age, because they can, like, you know, their brains can do more. They can imagine bad things happening. It can lead to more fear, nightmares, more separation anxiety. So remember how I said, it's not a test, because I'll tell you. In toddlers, in terms of racial development and understanding, there's preference for same race peer relationships. And what we see is that around age 3, that shifts, right? The research shows in this state that around 3 years old, regardless of the race of the child, you see more of a pro-white view, or wanting to go towards those peer relationships, those friendships, and having less of a positive view of the kids or themselves even of color, right? So that starts to come in. And that by age 4, they're having, kids have a sense of their own ethnic identity and of the way that their social group is perceived by society. And that's with white kids and kids of color, right? They have an understanding of their own ethnic group and how that's seen by those around them. And they can begin to internalize those racial biases. So you've done toddler, preschool. I'm looking at time. Stacie, you were right.
All right.
School age. So we're at 6 to 10, and then I'm done. So 6 to 10. Abstract thinking starts happening for that cognitive development. They can hold 2 things in mind. They can understand how things are alike and how things are different at the same time. They can communicate more effectively. They have a longer attention span, and they can better understand, like, not just fairness and the concrete, like this is okay to do and this is not, but a moral sense of why things are okay. And they're starting to develop that ability of perspective taking. So it's not just about their own way of thinking or feeling, and that means everyone thinks and feels that way, but they understand that other people might think or feel differently about something. So then, because of that, they're socially really into friends. They want to make friends. That peer connection is really important. They understand that they can have two emotions at the same time. They can feel or think differently about one person. They might like this about them and not this about them. And it's really important for them to be accepted by their peers. And there is an increased concern or interest about justice and fairness. And then in terms of racial understanding or development in that school age period, by age 7, they are ascribing characteristics to groups. So like this group of people, whether it's racial, right? It includes racial, but it can be gender, it can be religious, it can be ethnic, whatever the group, they can ascribe beliefs or characteristics to a group of people. And then around age 10, they have an understanding of their own involvement in racial understanding. So how what they do impacts the understanding about racial identity and interactions and how other people see them. And I'm going to call this good news, is that that negative bias towards children of color seems to weaken around 2nd and 3rd grade, and that for Black children, their pro-Black attitude is increasing. Something happens around that 2nd, 3rd grade age time where that shift occurs that maybe we can capitalize on. Okay, Stacie, older kids.
Off to me. Okay, so I'm going to talk about adolescence. And I will just give a general overture of what adolescence is, and then I'll break it down a little bit into the two groups that we've broken it into. So a definition for adolescence is it's the transitional stage of physical and psychological development that occurs from childhood, usually starting at the onset of puberty and into young adulthood. However, we do know that adolescence is much more than just that when we take into consideration cognitive, social, and emotional components of this developmental period. So during this transitional period, which generally runs from ages 13 to 19, but it can start as young as 10 years old, the individual starts to ponder various questions at varying degrees about autonomy and their identity, and they work toward this discovery of their sense of self and how to face and deal with different challenges related to friendships, family, academics, community, etc. So similar to early childhood, the adolescent brain is constantly growing and developing, and these changes significantly reinforce the adolescent's ability to make decisions and have more complex cognitive thinking patterns. Although this development is rapid, the process does take time, so much so that research shows that the brain is not really fully developed until we are in our mid-20s, around 25 years old. So keeping that in mind is always important when we're interacting with people that are in their adolescent ages. The primary changes that we see cognitively for adolescents are an increase and, well, a development first, and an increase in their abstract thinking. So they don't need to have a concrete idea of concepts. They're really able to think a little bit more outside the box. The other piece is advanced reasoning. So they're able to predict results of their actions a little bit more, which allows them to plan for the future. And then there's this concept called metacognition, and essentially that's thinking about thinking. And so this allows adolescents to be able to reflect on the ways that they came up with different answers and the ways that they're thinking and how that impacts their behaviors and their decisions. Socially, during the time of adolescence, it's really a time of expansion of their social network. So you're seeing much more focus on formation of relationships, spending more time with peers, and it's really a focus on extra-familial relationships. So that's why there's a central focus on their friendships. There's a central focus even in a building of relationships with extra-familial adults. So mentors, coaches, friends of those nature that might be adults. They learn to maintain an identity associated with their social relationships, which allows them to increase their empathy, increase their communication skills, and, which is also good news, increase the appreciation of differences between them and others. And the other thing that I'll say is that they really start to invest a lot more into their relationships very differently. So they may take on some leadership roles. And then this is also when we start to see them forming romantic relationships. So there's just a different framework in the way that they conceptualize friendships and peer relationships. So the way that Alison and I decided to break down adolescence was into two groups. Younger adolescents, which is ranging from ages 11 to 14, and then older adolescents ranging from ages 15 to 19. So for younger adolescents, what we'll see is definitely more examples of that complex thinking. I know that Alison mentioned school age, that's when they start to have some perspective taking. So we're really seeing that develop and pick up some pace, pick up some force, where they're able to put themselves in another person's shoes. And I'm sure parents and teachers can attest to this. This is when they really start to question authority more. Which is good because they're using their brains, but it might not always feel so great as the adult or the authority figure. And then socially, they're developing a better understanding of their social roles, and a follow through from school age. Social acceptance becomes a very important focus for them as well. So then we move into older adolescents, where this abstract and hypothetical thinking really starts to develop and expand. And they have the capacity to be able to understand and think about the consequences of their thoughts and actions without having to experience them. They may not always do that, and I'll talk about why later, but they do have the capacity and the ability to do so. They're also really thinking about themselves. So we see a lot of introspection and self-reflection, and also thinking more about their role as they emerge into adulthood. And also socially, with peer relationships, that becomes even more of a central focus, even more a part of their identity. And there's an emphasis on loyalty, trust, and understanding of their friends and the people that they spend time with. And what we do see because of that, there is an increase in cognitive empathy. And this is a benefit because it allows them to really be able to problem solve and develop conflict resolution skills better. And then we also see an increase in emphasis on their moral values. And so what's wonderful about adolescence is this moral values piece, they take some of it from the adults in their life that might have helped instill that, but then they also have the ability to be able to think about their own morals and values and see how that gets embedded and infused into their identity. So as I mentioned before, even though that they have all of these cognitive capacities, abilities, very high level thinking, one thing that is really important to keep in mind is that the cognitive and social development can be uneven because it's greatly impacted by emotionality. So adolescents really are guided by their feelings and their emotions at times. So we don't see a straight linear development in these cognitive and social developmental skills. And with regard to race and their understanding of race, so since they're having much more experience with extra familial socialization experiences, this is a critical time where their racial identity becomes more salient for them. Now, in early adolescence, because they have a deeper awareness and a deeper understanding of the impact of social inequality, they might start to question a little bit more or start to think more critically about examples of bias, discrimination, and prejudice that they are noticing. But I also think it's important to note that for children of color, this happens before adolescence because these conversations are often happening before they're adolescent. And studies have shown that more than 2/3 of African American and Latinx youth, as young as 8 years old, start to report exposure and experiences of racial discrimination. So their awareness and their understanding of it starts to develop a little bit earlier than adolescence. So that brings me to a discussion about racial stress and trauma. So if we were to define trauma, essentially what it is it's an incident or incidents of exposure to death or threatened death, actual or threatened serious illness, actual or threatened sexual violation that can happen directly or indirectly to a person. So what racial trauma is, it basically consists of dangerous or frightening race-based events, stressors, and discrimination that negatively impacts a person's quality of life, and it causes fear, a sense of helplessness, and horror. And so with racial trauma, this can be a result of either one major experience of racism or an accumulation of many multiple smaller experiences. And they can be smaller experiences such as discrimination or microaggressions, just certain comments about hair or certain comments about interests. That's something that can feed into this idea of racial trauma. And then racial stress essentially is the psychological distress that is associated with someone's experience of racism and racial trauma. So exposure to racial trauma can lead to significant detrimental effects to someone's physical, mental, emotional health. And due to it, we can see the onset of physiological symptoms, we can see behavioral concerns and problems, trauma symptoms, and other psychological symptoms, including anxiety and depression. So keeping all of that in mind, that brings us to this question or this rationale for why is it important to have this discussion. And so there's a few points to keep in mind of why we need to talk to our children and our teens about race and racism. Because first, as mentioned above, identifying race and racial differences starts very young, as early as 6 months, as Alison was mentioning. The second point is because the negative effects and high prevalence of racial stress and trauma continue to occur, and because of the resulting detrimental impacts of it, as I mentioned before, with physical, mental, and emotional well-being being impacted. Additionally, it's important for us to have these conversations because it helps build awareness and provide a safe space for our children and teenagers to talk about their experiences, what they're observing, even those overlooked experiences of those microaggressions, and witnessing, some examples of humiliation, etc., so that those aren't being internalized and they have a secure space for them to be able to process that. Another reason that it's important for us to have these discussions with our youth is because talking about race really equips children with knowledge early so that they can be a part of the change that is necessary and become advocates and allies in the advocacy as we work toward equal treatment of their peers and of our peers. And then lastly, I'll say another reason that is important is because research has shown that all children are negatively impacted by racism, children of color and white children, and their experiences are different, even in utero. So, for example, there was a research done by Rosenthal et al. Who observed that when African American and Latina mothers reported experiences of racism or discrimination during their pregnancies, their children were more likely to be delivered with low birth rates and to have more difficulty achieving developmental milestones. So it's just a snippet of some of the reasons why these conversations are so important to have with our youth. So now we will talk about how to talk to them about these conversations.
Okay, so we're going to start younger, moving older. And generally speaking, particularly with the younger kids, they learn so much through observation, and they are observant. They are picking up on things and they are understanding things based on the adults around them, the friends around them, pretty much everything around them. So one really important key to having this discussion is to be comfortable having it. So it sounds pretty obvious, and it's difficult because particularly living in America, talking about race and racism is a challenging thing to do. And so here I am as a white woman talking to a crowd of people about race, and I'm feeling a little bit anxious about it, right? And I have to keep doing that, right? So in order to be comfortable and in order to demonstrate that this is something that is okay to talk about, that needs to be talked about, and so that I can be an effective and moral human being, psychologist, mother, we have to practice it. So some of you might be thinking about questions that you have or you want to take the opportunity to ask and be nervous to do so. So one thing you could do is ask it and practice being comfortable being part of the conversation. Another thing that is important to think about is we're talking about discussing race with all children, right? And it is going to look a little bit different depending on the racial category of the child that you're talking to. So when we're engaging with children of color, Black and brown kids, we want to be paying attention to developing their cultural racial pride and building up their resiliency to the world that they are going to enter. And that's going to look a little bit different than how we talk about, different and the same, as how we talk about race with white children. So when we're at the toddler stage, remember, short attention spans, we're not going to sit and have conversations with them, right? But we are going to be developing play materials that they have and books that they're looking at, even thinking about the packaging in which these things arrive, right? Like the diapers that are there. What color are the kids on those diaper boxes? What color are the kids who are on their toy boxes? And not just thinking about the books and the shows and all those things, but look at your own social networks, right? Like, what do the people look like that they're engaging with, that you're bringing into your home, which probably isn't happening now because of COVID, but before COVID, who was coming into your home and whose homes were you going into? And so really trying to create an environment where they're seeing a diverse group of people and what they look like. We also don't want to shy away from describing racial differences. So again, remember at this age, kids are learning and expressing themselves through play. So if you're playing with dolls or you're reading books, to describe them. This character is a boy or is wearing a blue shirt and has brown skin. And this character, this prince, this mermaid, whatever it is tall and has white skin or has peachy skin or has beige skin. And to put that out there so that they learn that this is okay to talk about. You might be outside and trying to describe someone or tell them something, and you're like describing everything about the person except for the color of their skin. The child knows that because they know the color of the person's skin. So it's okay to say that man with brown skin, right? Don't shy away because then the kid is learning that something's wrong with this. For children of color, again, thinking about that resiliency and pride, cultural, racial pride, we want to do a lot of commenting on how awesome their body is. Like, your skin is beautiful and your hair is awesome. And I love the way that your face looks like this, or commenting very matter-of-factly and in concrete terms, and celebrating it, right? And so, and then for adults who are talking to white kids, we want them to like their bodies too. We're not like, white kids, you can't like the way your hair looks or your eyes are okay. We want them to feel that. And we also want them to understand that they're great because of lots of other things. So for the adults here who have a child in their lives that is white, that you love, that you think is the best, you're just like, yeah, my kid's the best one. It's probably not because of the color of their skin. Like if you're like, why do I love this kid? You probably aren't thinking because they're white. I doubt it. You're probably thinking it's because they're goofy or they're creative or they're like so adventurous. And those are the things we want to really be putting out there for white kids, because we don't want them to think or believe that they're all these awesome, wonderful things because of the color of their skin, right? We want to acknowledge that there's lots of different elements of them. When we're talking to any child, regardless of their color, we want to think about open-ended questions or pulling out some curiosity, right? Like, what do you notice about all of the characters in this book, right? Like, oh, I have like gender issues with like princes and princesses, but this isn't that talk. This is just like a racial talk, right? So like, why are all of these kings white, right? Or have you noticed, or I'm noticing, and putting it out there, but also trying to have examples and needing to have examples of people who look all different colors, and characters of color that go against the stereotypes that we're trying to fight against, right? So that they see themselves in all different places. And so white kids see them in all different places. Okay. So then we get to preschoolers, and that's the whys. Why? And you can get a little scientific with them, right? So they're noticing skin color. Why is my skin this color and this kid's skin's this color? Or why, mom, dad, is your skin color this color and my skin color is this color? Well, there's something called melanin. Melanin makes your skin darker. And you can talk to them about that, of like, how cool is that your body makes its own sunscreen? Like, it's protecting you, right? There's a wonderful psychologist, Dr. Beverly Tatum, who said to her young son of color that like, you won, like you have the most melanin in your class. And he was like psyched about it, right? Like, I won, because it's just what it is, right? And kind of explaining to white kids, you have less, and you can go into the ethnic cultural background, right? Our family comes from a place where it's colder. There's not as much sun. You don't need as much melanin in your skin. But when it's summertime and the sun comes out, you get a little bit darker because your skin's protecting you. And then with preschoolers too, it's fairness. So you can use that language with them. They want things to be fair. Fair is important. So if we're trying to, like, how do we talk about issues of race or racism? We can talk about what's fair and what's not fair, or categorizing people. They're doing that already, right? They're putting things into categories. That includes people. So you can make comments about what they see. So like, for example, have you noticed that most of your preschool teachers are white, and most of the people at your preschool who are cleaning up the classroom have brown skin, right? That's not because white people are better at teaching than brown people are, or that brown people like cleaning up more than white people do. It's about the opportunities they have, right? It's about how easy it is for one group to become something than the other, and that's not fair. And so like, in our family, we're trying to make things more fair, right? Like, this is what we do because everyone should have the same. They get the same, they get that. So then, there was a honk. We're going to school age kids, and I am appreciating that this is going quickly, so I'm hoping you're taking notes, and Stacie and I are also going to give you our email addresses, and you can always kind of email us any other questions, and we are going to provide a resources page, so don't worry. So for school age kids, you can introduce the term of racism, right? So you can take teasing and bullying, which is something that it's talked a lot about in schools, a lot. Bullying is like the buzzword. So beginning in school age, you can call racism a big type of bullying, like a really bad type of bullying. And you can start to talk about not just their own small world, because cognitively they're able to like zoom out. So you can begin talking about like systemic racism, but you're like, oh my God, how could I talk about systemic racism with an 8-year-old? That's hard, right? But you can, because you can do it in a concrete way that matches what they can understand. So things like, in our culture, in our country, people with brown skin tend to be paid less than people with white skin. And they're arrested more, or they're put in jail more. There's less access. They're not able to get to, access might be a hard word for that age, but you could teach it to them. Good schools or extracurriculars. They don't get to go to the pool where you do to get swim lessons, right? And that we can do things to change that. and to work to change that, because we also want there to be optimism and that there is some agency there, right? It's not like doom and gloom, but that we can do things differently. And remember too, that this is the age where verbal aggression is coming in. So bullying is happening. That's why it's talked about so much. So we want to give kids the words to say if this is happening to them or if they're seeing it happening, right? So if you are engaging or parenting a child of color, you want to be direct and say, people might bully you or tease you or leave you out or say something harmful or hurt you because of the color of your skin, and that is not okay. And if that ever happens, you tell them to stop and you tell an adult that you trust. And you tell me. And you could sit with that child and identify the adult that they trust, because it might not be their teacher. Not because their teacher's bad, but just might not be their teacher, right? It might be another adult. And so you want them to go and you can practice it with them. Okay, now you tell me what you're gonna say, right? If this happens, tell me, and rehearse. And the same thing if you're a parent or an important adult in a white child's life. If you see this is not okay, and we stand up and we say something, and we protect the kid that's getting bullied because of their race. Again, they know to protect kids that are bullied, but this is bullying because of their race. And you let me know, and let's practice what you're gonna say. So again, surface, there's so much more, but those are some ideas of ways that you can talk to and help facilitate pride in racial, ethnic identity in kids of color, and also how you can help white kids understand and feel pride in themselves too, but also how to reduce racism in our culture. Little steps. Stacie, you're up.
My turn. I think this is great because the examples that Alison has given really highlight what I mentioned before, is that being honest and specific at every developmental stage is so key and so important. It's just really about the appropriateness and the way, you know, sometimes you have to be creative, but the way that you think about that honesty and that specificity. So the other thing I'll highlight before talking a little bit more about adolescents and how to talk to them is reminding yourself and continuing to remind yourself that this is not a one-time conversation. Think of it more as a series of conversations. This is something that you're going to revisit often when there's issues that come up, when you're watching a movie, when you're reading a book, when they have experiences at school with adults or children. So the more that you do it, the more comfortable you become and the more comfortable they become. So just kind of keep that ingrained, that this is a series of conversations. Alison did mention this before that, and I think it's definitely important to highlight that these conversations about race and racism mean different things for children of color compared to children who are white. So for adolescents of color, this conversation might focus a little bit more on discussions around safety, because the world sees them as a threat, especially our Black and brown boys. But for white adolescents, the conversation is really going to be focused more around awareness of their privilege and how they can use that privilege to support their peers of color and to be allies for social justice. So I will speak a little bit more generally in terms of things that you can keep in mind when having these conversations, and then I'll go into the specific questions that you might ask our older adolescents and our younger adolescents. So when you're speaking to adolescents, it's really important to remember to provide an open space for them to reflect and talk about their feelings, talk about what they've witnessed and what they've heard in the media, in their schools, and in their own peer circles, because that open discussion allows them to be able to have the opportunity to process what they're taking in, whether it's emotional stress or cognitive stress, and so that they can be able to discuss that and also have an opportunity to really reflect on it. I think it's also really important to talk about history, the history of racial oppression and discrimination. Adolescents, you know, sometimes you might see it, but they really are thirsty for education. So sometimes you see it, sometimes you don't, but overall, this is a really great time for them to be educated about how systemic racism has impacted the history of our country, the world, and also how it impacts us today. Not only, as we mentioned, it impacts all children, all adults, regardless of what color your skin is. So I think it's also important to keep in mind that adolescents do, because they do have a better awareness of injustice based on what they might be exposed to, you can really guide them by providing them resources that can educate them and that can help them navigate their confusion or questions or understanding about race and racism, and use their critical thinking skills, right? We're thinking about how developed and how complex their cognitive abilities are at this stage and how they're continuing to grow. So really challenge their critical thinking. So resources that you might share with them are watch documentaries together, watch films together, read different books and kind of ask questions. And as Alison mentioned, we will provide a list of resources of different books and articles and movies, etc., that you can use. I will point out that I think that it's particularly for children of color, when talking about history of racism, slavery, and particularly slavery, one thing that's important is not to emphasize or focus on slaves as victims. You really also want to talk about the stories and the history of their resistance and their resilience. And I think Dr. Beverly Tatum really does highlight that as well when she does an explanation of her descriptions of how she talked about slavery, even to her 4-year-old, really highlighting that, the power and the strength and the resilience that developed for people of color. And one thing that I will point out that is a resource now where you can get some information on documentaries and films is Common Sense Media. They break it down based on developmental level, and they have just a plethora of resources that you can have access to. Another general point to keep in mind is provide opportunities for your children and your adolescents to hear the thoughts and feelings of people who are impacted by racism. So if you have a friend of color, let them talk about it. Let them interview them. Let them have conversations with them. Maybe even if you're a teacher, weave that into your lesson plans where they're looking at videos, where they're listening to narratives, and then have them reflect on the emotionality that they observed while watching it and how that then also makes them feel, because then that also helps bring sensitivity to their understanding of what the person's lived experience is, and it also helps them promote empathy in them so that they can then be allies, or they can also then be advocates for change. I think this is one of the most important examples to keep in mind is be a model. Be an example, right? We learn best from observation and from modeling and then doing. So you want to find ways that you can get involved and contribute to activism and change, and then engage your adolescent in that activity, whether it's, looking up different activist groups online, or donating, or marching for a cause, whatever the case may be. But that's a really powerful way for you to show and model behavior that you want your adolescents to emulate. Something on even a smaller scale is diversify what's in your home, as Alison mentioned. So it starts with toys when they're younger, but diversify the bookshelves that are on your, the books that are on your bookshelves, the movies that are in your media station, the music that you listen to, even down to social media accounts, because we know adolescents are really consumed in their phones and social media. Maybe talk about who you're following. You're not following the same types of people. Diversify the people that you're following in social media as well, and then have conversations about that. Alison talked a little bit about this concept of promoting cultural pride. And I think that it's very important, especially during adolescence, because this is really the formation of that focus on their autonomy and their identity. And so especially for adolescents of color, you really want to instill confidence and promote pride in their culture and in their identity as a person of color. So this might look like, you promoting how beautiful their skin and their hair is, but not focusing just on the physical features. Talk about their intellect, right? Talk about their empathy. Talk about those internal attributes that can help them develop a positive self-image and a positive cultural and racial identity. And then also surround them with images of strong Black leaders. And that falls into the education part. Talk about, the activists, Martin Luther King, Malcolm X, all of those people that have really made some change. In your effort to teach and educate, it's really important when you're talking to adolescents to be mindful of not taking over the discussion. they are curious and they want to learn, as we mentioned. So think more broadly in terms of open-ended questions and really let them lead the conversation. Let them ask the questions so that they feel that they have that space to be able to ask whatever it is that they're curious about, and then also talk about whatever it is that they're feeling. And lastly, you know, I will say before going into some questions, again, because they are immersed in social media and just media in general, we're not only thinking about how can they diversify the people that they follow, but tapping into this developmental level of being a critical thinker, abstract, hypothetical, complex. Really talk to them about being critical in terms of their thought process about all forms of media that they're getting. So help them learn to analyze media portrayals of incidents in the news. You know, like, what perspective is this news station taking? Think critically about what they're reading and what they're hearing so that they can come up with their own analysis and their own ideas of how they're taking in that information. So now the big question is, so conversation starters, right? So where do I go from there? Yes, I can educate. Yes, I can diversify what I'm exposing them to, but what do we do to talk to them about this? So as a reminder, we talked about socialization being a central focus of adolescence. So one way to really start talking to them about race and infusing it in conversations is to ask them about their friends at school, right? Maybe say, who are your best friends at school and what do you have in common with them? Have you thought about, you know, how you decide who you're going to be friends with, or what's important to you in a friendship? Now, even with those questions, race may not readily come up, you know, and they may not readily, you know, have answers that kind of point to any concepts of diversity and race. And that's okay. You know, you can still engage in the conversation, but you can naturally weave race in. So you can even have them critically think about how diverse and segregated they think their school is. How diverse and segregated do they think the school friend groups are, right? What's their observations of that? How diverse is their friend group? Are the same that we talked about with school-age children, as Alison was saying, are there teachers? What's the diversity of diverse makeup of their teachers in their school building? And do their teachers talk about race? Are they incorporating that in their lesson plans? You know, challenge them to think about that and maybe even discuss it with teachers. More specifically around current situations with everything that's happening in the news, if it can be very uncomfortable to bring up conversations about the violence and aggression and all of that that's happening around social injustice. So some ideas or some recommendations for how to bring that up is you can say, you know, there's been a lot on the news lately about racial injustice and addressing racism. How are you feeling about that? You know, how are you feeling about what you're seeing and what you're hearing? You can even throw in how you feel about it, right? I'm feeling really angry. I'm feeling really sad. I'm feeling really anxious about all the violence and all the discrimination that I'm hearing about on the news. I just want to check in with you to see how you're feeling about it. How are you thinking about it? Do you have any questions for me? So, you know, I think throwing yourself into that too, so that they know it's okay to have these feelings, really does open the door for a conversation as well. Specifically for parents of color, right? If you can ask them, have you ever felt someone treated you differently based on the color of your skin? You can even ask your white adolescents that, right? Have you noticed that you're getting treated differently around friends or in school based on the color of your skin? And then you can say, what do you need from me? How can I support you? How can we address this together? So that was for, you know, the younger adolescents. There's also some specific questions. For your older adolescents, it can be even broader, right? Even more open-ended. And I think weaving in conversations about what they're seeing online and social media, I think is really important, because then you can also talk about if there's something that comes up that bothers them, how they can address it, you know, how they might be able to post what their response is and what are appropriate ways to do that. You can ask them, you know, how do you think the color of a person's skin influences how they see the world? That's a very broad question that requires a lot of that abstract thinking, right? When we're talking about their developmental stage. What can you learn from experiences of people of different races, right? Really thinking about that pulls into that socialization piece, you know, when they're talking about maybe their friend makeup, their friend group, the makeup of their friendship groups, and really having them think about what can they learn from people who are different from them. And if you recall, that was one thing that I mentioned before during the developmental stages, is there is an appreciation for the differences between them and others during this stage of development. You can also bring in this idea of, I know that there's been a lot of discussions about racial injustice recently. How are you dealing with it? Similar to what you would say to the younger children, and weaving in media coverage, right? When you're seeing what you're seeing on the media, what do you think about, what is happening? What do you think about what's going on with police brutality? How do you think that makes people of color feel? How does that make you feel, etc.? So those are a few examples of questions. In terms of asking adolescents of color directly too about if they have had any direct experiences of racism themselves. How did you handle that? Who did you talk to? What did you say? Are there issues coming up, within your peer group or with other friends that, with other teachers or other adults or people that you're coming in contact with, or even if it's someone at the grocery store, right, who maybe said something to them that was uncomfortable or inappropriate? Have them think of either specific examples or things that they are kind of being exposed to. And you can even ask them if they talk about race and culture with their friends. So those are just a few examples of questions that you can raise with your adolescents that, again, as you notice, they're not yes, no questions. They are really broad and allow for an open dialogue. And again, allowing the teenager, allowing the adolescent to be able to lead the discussion. So in conclusion, with teenagers, what I'd say is one of the best ways to approach the topic is to simply open the field for discussion. Be honest, be specific. You may be surprised with what your teens say. Sometimes you think they're not paying attention, but what you're saying and what you're addressing really does stick with them. And sometimes, a lot of times, they have pretty profound insights. And if at the time of the conversation, they don't have much to say, that's okay, because again, this is not a one-time conversation. This is something that's happening, and it's a series of discussions, a series of conversations. So there will be opportunities to revisit these topics, as long as you are modeling, that appropriateness in terms of conversation and choice and behavior. So that wraps up just kind of our talk about all of this. I want to reiterate that we will be providing a list of resources based on age group and based on genre, so books, videos, podcasts, etc. So you can expect to have that. But I think at this point, we'd like to open it up for a question. Okay. So I see you want to do I see a question. Oh, I do. It's directly to me. So the question is, how do you bring up the discussion when they've never been exposed to different colors, either maybe going to an all-white school or an all-black school? I think that is a really great question. And I think, I'll start with answering it. And I think maybe Alison, if she has anything to add, she can add. Similar to what we said before, it's really about opening the field, right, to the discussion. So even if they haven't been exposed to it, based on the school that they're attending, these kids are on social media. They're listening to the radio. They're listening to the news. So you can bring up the discussion. You can bring up the topic at any time, right? And maybe link it to what's happening in what they're hearing on social media or what they're hearing in the news or on the radio or on podcasts, right? What we said before, I've been hearing a lot about the murders of men of color. What are you thinking about that? How are you feeling about that? Have you heard about that? And then maybe even talking a little bit about what their friend groups are like, because even if they go to a predominantly white school or a predominantly a school that's predominantly of another culture, they have exposure, whether it's based on sports teams or whether even if they're going to the mall, they have exposure to seeing other people who do not look like them. So I think it's fine to sort of just open up the discussion at any point. And like we said, starting early, I think is a really important point to keep in mind. Okay, any other questions that people have?
This is more of a comment. I just want to say thank you to both doctors, because I think, so I have younger adolescent white male children, and I teach in the mostly African-American older adolescents. So I just am learning so much right now about just how to, and I try to have discussions to begin with, but what's really stuck with me is the idea of promoting a culture of pride, and how I, as a white teacher in particular, help to do that with my African-American students. And I think that's what's missing in school. Like, we can bring in various texts. I'm an English teacher, so we could read we've diversified our reading materials tremendously over the course of the years. But that's a key. And that's what, when you read about people who sort of, like Ta-Nehisi Coates brings us up, like, why are we still looking at video of the civil rights movement where people are getting hosed down, right? Treated like garbage, when, yes, we should know that historically, along with teaching and promoting a culture of pride. So I just want to thank you for that in particular, for both me as a parent and me as a teacher, and any ideas or other specifics you have in that realm would be highly welcome.
Do you want to start, Alison?
Yeah.
Okay.
Sorry, there was a working from home issue, but now it's been resolved. That's why I went dark for a second. So other ways that you can do that, yes, diversifying kind of the authors that you are providing to the kids around you. Also allowing them to do, like with older kids, them do the research, right? And them get interested in the things about their culture. I also think that people of color are very diverse, right? And understanding their origins and where they come from, and their own cultural identities within their racial identity, and celebrating the nuances of their history, right? So it's not just one history, it's many histories, and getting curious about that history. Part of that, the history is language. Part of the history is different religious beliefs and foods and music and all of those things that are celebratory, right? So I'm thinking, how do you bring joy into their sense of themselves and where they come from and what they look like? And there's fortunately been some more promotion of that. And resources for that for young kids and older kids. Just books with inspirational people who look like that or come from places where they come from. For younger kids, thinking about African folklore, folktale books. It's not just the traditional, like, white-centered folk tales, but how do you get into that oral history and into the different ways of expressing yourself, art. So, those are some ideas. Stacie, if you wanted to add
on. Actually, I was just going to add on to what you had mentioned about infusing some different creative aspects, right? So not only focusing on authors, right, of books and poems, but maybe allowing them to do some research on music, right, on Black artists, on people who are lawyers and senators, and all of these examples of where people of color, have shown strength and pride and resilience and have been able to excel, in a vast array. I think the more that you can open up their eyes to different, maybe employment opportunities or occupations, careers where there have been a lot of successful people of color, I think that also helps them. I know that we don't have to focus on just being this because of the color of our skin. So I think that's another example of how you can help promote cultural pride within the way that they view being a person of color and being allies and advocates for people of color.
I have a couple questions on the chat.
Okay.
Came just to me. It's like let's see who can get more questions. That was a joke.
Was that helpful? I just want to ask Brenda if that was helpful. Really.
Yes, thank
Okay,
you. Absolutely.
Great.
So in full disclosure, there's a question that I'm not sure the meaning of. If it could be clarified a little bit, I'm going to read the question out loud, and then if you're the person who wrote it, can maybe give you some more information. But it's about children starting to identify with families as early as 6 months. And the question, I think, is, are they able to really identify color? And it seems like, what does that look like with a Black child who has white parents? So I'm going to try to just talk more about it. And then if that was you like, and I don't hit exactly what you're asking, just clarify. So yes, kids as early as 6 months identify and can, we think about our senses, right? And we take in information through our senses. So as young as 6 months, babies take in the color of people, right? But it's just as they would take in the color of this toy car that I have, or this mobile, or this blanket, right? So they're just taking in the color. And then the study that I mentioned was children of color, or white children, identifying more with people who look the same color as their primary caregiver. So if it's a mixed race kind of dyad there, right, then that goes, we're kind of lucky, I would say, because then they have examples and they have a connection with more than one race at that early age, and it's like a positive, caring, trust relationship. So their preference for races, it's basically the preference is whatever their close caregiver is, whatever they look like, right? So it could be, they also have a preference for white and someone of color if they're being raised, or those primary. It could even be like a nanny, a babysitter, a grandparent, right? Whoever that core, not like it could even be, it seems judgy. Whatever that, whoever that person looks like, that's kind of what was meant by that. If I didn't quite get it, let me know.
I think, can I piggyback off that before? I also think what you mentioned previously is, I know COVID circumstances withstanding, but you also said before, like, keep in mind who you are engaging with, right? So I think that's another example of why it is important to expose them to, expose your children to diverse people of diverse backgrounds, because it helps with, even though, you know, obviously you have a preference for who's feeding you and taking care of you, but at least there is a different level of comfort that can come when they're seeing, when there's more exposure to people that look similar to them and that look different from them. Okay.
Thanks.
I just want to be mindful of our time. Maybe we just take like one more question.
Do you have one more? I have one more.
Yeah, we can go with your question. I don't have another one.
Okay, so I'll answer this one, and then again, if anyone has others, we are going to provide our email addresses that you can get in touch with us, and you'll be emailed a resource page. So this is not your last chance. But the question is, how do you talk to your African-American child in a predominantly white school about being comfortable with talking about race?
Yeah.
Stacie, you want to start? You want me to start?
I can start. Did they say the age of?
No.
No. Okay. Well, I think at first, sorry,
they just did 11.
11. Okay. Well, I think at first, the first point is to talk about the comfort about talking about the topic of race, right? So I think, and then it stems from this. So if you're comfortable talking to them about race and allowing them to feel comfortable talking about race with you, it changes the dynamic of and the feel of having those conversations. And so it equips them with this different sense of, you know, not familiarity, but an ability to not feel so uncomfortable with it because they're exposed to it more at home by talking about it with you. Granted, you know, if it was a predominantly white school, was it?
Yes.
Right. I think the other thing that is important that they can tap into is 11 years old, right? That's right at the brink of preteen, right? Pre-adolescence. And as you may remember, we talked about peer group being so focused, so central in terms of their focus. And so maybe that's where they start, right? They're comfortable with their friends. They're comfortable with their 2 best friends, their 3 best friends. So allowing them, when you start asking their questions about maybe diversity in their friend group, they can start to have those conversations with that just close nuclear group of friends. And then that can kind of spark the conversation for bringing it up in other contexts as well. So I would say I would maybe start there, like with your comfort and allowing them to feel comfortable talking about it with you, and then bringing it to their close nuclear friend group, because then it allows them to generalize that comfort a little bit more. Do you have anything to add, Allison?
Sure. So in addition, the 11-year-old are a little bit lucky there because they'll still play with you a little bit. So you can do some role plays with them, right? You can really give them the opportunity to practice these things at home with you. Like, okay, so who do you want to have this conversation with? Is it a teacher that is saying, that you want to give your perspective to, or that about what's being taught or how they're teaching it, or something they said, I'll be the teacher, you be you, or I'll be you and you be the teacher. Like, let's practice at home. Definitely what Stacie said about having these conversations often so that it becomes comfortable. It becomes something that, isn't always going to be 100% comfortable, but at least comfortable to talk to you about, so that then you can kind of give them that extra support. And knowing that it's really important at that age and older too, that they're accepted by peers, that they don't want to be different, right? They want to be the same. They want to be accepted. And they also can hold in mind that they can be different and the same at the same time. And that's great, right? That we need that you have so much to offer. And so definitely what Stacie said about starting with people you trust, right? Like that small group, those your best friends, and having them practice with that and see how it goes. See if what they're afraid is going to happen happens. And hopefully it doesn't. And then they'll have more bravery to keep doing it. And even if it does, they get through it, right? And we learn for the next time, and we can support them differently. And saying, this is how I'm impacted by this because of my identity, because I am Black and you all aren't, and this is how this makes me feel, and going for the feeling can really help those around them understand and want to do differently, right? Because they're starting with how it's impacting them, and particularly their friends, their teachers. They're going to want to listen and understand, and so I imagine that they might be surprised by the kind of the support that they get through it that way. Okay.
All right.
We got to thank you. So I think that helped.
Wonderful.
So again, just really appreciate everyone's time and commitment to being here and hearing and listening and asking questions. And, my hope, and I know Stacie's hope too, was that this is just continuing the conversation and not letting kind of this time go by without us like pursuing understanding and talking to kids and helping make changes where there need to be changes in terms of kids understanding and our understanding about racial justice and the realities of what's going on right now, and how we can support our kiddos during this time and hopefully create a place where they don't need so much resilience. Like they need it, but hopefully maybe not so much. Right. You will get those resources, as we mentioned, and our information for follow-up. And Stacie, do you want to?
No, I just want to say thank you so much for your time. Thank you so much for your questions. This was wonderful, to be able to have this opportunity, because like we said, we have to have confidence in our children that they can handle these topics, but we model that. And so hopefully this was helpful in you being able to find different ways to model it so that you can equip them, with this ability to be able to have these conversations and set the course for this change, because that's what we're really working for. That's one of the main reasons we're having this discussion. So thank you so much for your time, and we really appreciate it. It's been a pleasure.
Okay. Bye.
Take care.